Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to this digital Southeast Asia. I have a couple of slides to work through in a second, but I want to kind of take a moment since this is a brown bag series to introduce myself. If any of you haven't met me, or maybe give you new information if you haven't met me before. So my name is Brandon Milioti. I'm the South and Southeast Asian Studies librarian here at Yale University. I just started it last July. After completing a PhD in political science. And my PhD dissertation at that time was focused on really the ethnic politics at the intersection of Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar. So really right there on the borderline between South and Southeast Asia. And then also like really peripheral to both in a very real way. And so it gives you this kind of fun perspective for dealing with issues of regional studies and area studies. And during my PhD as well, I took a sort of very non-traditional political science student. And so I spent a lot of time hanging out with people in area studies and South Asian studies and Central Asian studies, as well as in the anthropology department, taking classes in ethnography and ethnic history and even some geography along the way. And so I really try to bring all of that into my approach to librarianship and collection development. And I think that you'll see that as we work through this presentation. I'm just switching to screen share. Okay, great. Okay, everyone can see the slides? Fantastic. Okay, so we actually already went through this cover slide. And I always write on the bottom of my slides, introduce self, just in case I forget. So I know I did that this time around. I have a plan of attack for today. Generally speaking, I want to talk a little bit of, about collection development more broadly, so you guys can kind of understand how librarians go about acquiring new materials or building our collections for area studies, and then how you can sort of best work with me to get things that you want to see. And then I'm going to jump into some of the really kind of cool advantages to using digital materials and digital archives. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the new things that we've purchased recently, as well as things that have been around for a while. It's just kind of the first time that I put them all under one page, and so it'll be a little easier to access, hopefully. And then I'm going to end by reminding you about some university-wide projects, really sort of nationwide projects, to give you more access to digital materials in these times with libraries around the country closed, the buildings being closed. And then I'm going to talk about maximum utility, which is my little tongue-in-cheek reference to rational choice, and just tell you how to maximize the bang for your buck when working with librarians and working with libraries for your research goals, both during this particular period and hopefully into the future as well. So just a little overview. I think that one of the things about Yale's collection development and the way that I build the Southeast Asian Studies collection here at Yale is that it really is driven by the interest, the research and teaching interest of our faculty, of our graduate students, and of our undergraduate students, right? And so it's really based on those interests. And as a result, we've had a certain kind of emphasis over the years, right? So traditionally speaking, we've really focused on, just want to make sure that I have the chat. Oh, my slides are not advancing. Is that true for everybody? Nobody can see the slides moving up? Why is that?
Brandon, when you do the screen share, this is Eric speaking.
Yeah.
When you do the screen share, it's showing, you have to choose the right version of the PowerPoint when you do the screen share, because it's showing your main PowerPoint screen, not the actual slideshow itself.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that, guys. Let me just.
Now it just advanced. Now whatever you did there, it advanced.
Oh, okay. So maybe I will just keep it here on out of presentation mode.
Yeah, we're now on the slide called overview.
Okay, that looks great. So I'll just keep it on this, and then you'll see my occasional speaker notes on the bottom. That'll work just fine. Okay, everybody's good now. We're on overview. Great. Sorry about that. It's good to know. Thank you for warning me. Okay, so like I was saying, the particular strengths of the collection at Yale for Southeast Asian Studies are particularly in for materials coming from or about Vietnam and Indonesia, and then by extension materials in Vietnamese or Bahasa Indonesia. So, and that's a reflection of both research interest and the fact that we teach those two languages. It's also a reflection of sort of the timing that the collection was started. It has to do a little bit of sort of Cold War politics at the time and how Yale was cooperating with the Library of Congress and other universities in the US to build a sort of national repository of Southeast Asian materials. There's kind of a cool history there as well. But primarily it's about faculty interest in what we're teaching. However, there are some like important things that I've been trying to do to start to maintain that interest, but also to deepen some of our collections for other countries in a more comprehensive and sort of structured way. So one of the things I've learned, especially working in Professor Harm's class, is that there's actually a huge demand for Philippine studies, Filipiniana materials, and within that sort of especially Tagalog materials. And we have been collecting for Philippine studies in the past, but sort of on a purchase by purchase basis. And we're really sort of working hard to get a slightly more comprehensive approach to building that collection, right? And then there's a continuing interest in building more materials from Myanmar, both in Burmese as well as in non-Burman languages, such as Kachin and Karen. And part of this is, of course, driven by James Scott's research interests and students working with him, but there's also sort of a broader interest in comparative research looking at Myanmar political transition and changes, different kinds of political changes and movements within the country. And so I've been working closely with several vendors and consultants to bring us a stronger breadth of materials for that region as well. And then finally, I have my own little agenda as somebody who spends time in both regions, in both South and Southeast Asia. I think that there's sort of a room to think about borderland studies as sort of something that's increasingly important. So both thinking about interregional relations between South and Southeast Asia, but also these more peripheral areas, maybe at the border of Myanmar and Laos, or highland Southeast Asian cultures, and so on. There's a place that I'm increasingly looking to and slowly kind of reorganizing some of the collection development goals that I have over time. So what this is to say, and now you can see the slides on the side, so there's no surprise slides anymore, I suppose. What this really means is that the collection is really built almost entirely based on my knowledge of faculty and student interests. So there's a real incentive here, and I'm always trying to remind people that you can consult with the librarian even if you don't have a specific question in mind, or you're not looking for a very specific book or something like along those lines. Just letting the librarian kind of know what your broad interests are provides us with support to collect in that area, right? And so it's also a really good opportunity for integrating librarians in your research throughout the whole research cycle, right? So in the sense of like your initial interests allow us to build a collection that can further support your intellectual development as the project progresses. That's something I always want to remind people of, because it really is based on faculty and student interests first and foremost. Jumping into digital archives and collections, there's this kind of funny space for digital archives where I think for plenty of good reasons, most disciplines favor the use of field-based research in physical archives, right? And that goes for historians as much as it goes for anthropologists and people in humanities, as well as various other social sciences. But there's some real advantages to working with digital materials, right? And some of this has to do with the fact that right now, you really have to rely on digital materials, of course, given the current restrictions on travel, etc. But there's also sort of more long-term advantages that you can think about and really start thinking about the place for digital archives and other types of digital resources in your research from an early stage, even beyond the current restrictions that we're all living under, means that you can really sort of use these in a more strategic way as opposed to just reacting to the current crisis. Now, I did quite a bit of archival research during my time in India as well as in Myanmar. And in both places, I had a great time, but there were certain advantages that I wish I had more digital archives that I could pull from. Part of this has to do with identifying and locating materials. So digital archives offer obvious advantages when it comes to keyword search. They're often categorized. A lot of these things that I'll be showing you today also have sort of essays written by subject specialists that use those materials directly from the archive. So if you're not quite sure how you can use a letter written between two colonial officers in your research, this will give you an example of how that kind of data can be best used in various types of research projects in different disciplines, right? There's also really cool visual aids that these things come with where you can kind of see the connections between regions and watch how like a policy memo kind of moves through space, right? How it gets delivered to different officers and so on. And that kind of visual information for me is incredibly valuable, and I'm sure it is for other people as well. Beyond that, you have the obvious advantage of having home access. You have the ease of printing and downloading these materials. This really is sort of hard to overstate, right? Obviously, we're all under sort of stay-at-home, shelter-in-place quarantine measures, what have you. But even in the field, it can be really interesting to negotiate access. And so I'm sure that everybody's had this, everybody's done research in South or Southeast Asia has had similar experiences of needing like 5 different copies of your passport photo and filling out forms in triplicate. I actually suspect that maybe things are a little different in some of the other Southeast Asian cities, but this has been my experience. In Myanmar, for example, I had this really interesting experience where I had to write a letter, so in addition to all the forms, I had this kind of formal letter requesting access to the archives from the head archivist, as well as the letters from my university, from the granting agency, and from my host institution. And then when I was done, I had to write a letter of thanks to the archivist, right? Where this is very sort of flowery language that was used, like, thank you for allowing me access to your grand collection, this sort of thing. And this is all like really good experience, but it's nice to be able to not have to do that for the whole project, right? And it's nice, in fact, to be able to use these kinds of materials without necessarily needing to go through all of that. The other real advantage here is that a lot of these collections are combining resources from multiple physical archives. And so you might find some of the materials in Gale Archives Unbound that I'll be showing you in a second have things in there that would otherwise be housed in London, Delhi, Yangon, right? At least, right? And then maybe they're housing up other places. And they're all brought under one roof for you. And of course, it would be very hard to negotiate access to all of those physical locations on any kind of dissertation funding or even faculty research allowance. This allows you to kind of add a little bit to round out your research. And so all that is to say that digital archival materials are, they are primary resources. I think there's this sense that they're somehow lesser than, or this a little harder because they're a little easier to access, that somehow doesn't count. Of course that's not true, but also they come with sort of the same kinds of baggage that you'd expect any sort of archival materials to come with, right? So you have the same issues of like, okay, who decided that I would get access to this? Who decided to curate this into that collection? A lot of these same questions you would ask of digital archives would also be asked of physical archives. So actually, even presents kind of a really fun way to start thinking about archives more broadly, as opposed to just sites for finding information, really as sites for finding a particular kind of information that's been tailored and negotiated in some ways. And so there's kind of it's actually a fun way to start thinking about those things. I also think that just one more thing on the advantages, the digital archival materials can be used at different stages in your research. And so it's something to think about is it might not be the primary core thing for this. Let's use a dissertation, for example. It might not be the primary source of information for your dissertation, but it might provide you key information and a sense of what kinds of information might be in physical archives during your prospectus time, right? Or while you're drafting, even just the drafting process of that proposal. And then when you come home again, you might need access to those materials again as a way of rounding out your research or adding components that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to get. So it really offers these sort of wonderful ways to round out and to sort of integrate archival research throughout your research process, as opposed to just in one key site where you're trying to collect as much information as you can. All right, so now that I've convinced you, and you all look very convinced, by the way. Eric's skeptical, but it's okay. I'm just kidding. Yeah. I wanted to just show you this list of things that I've recently got. We're not going to go through all of these today, but I wanted to give you a sense of the ways that these things are built, right? So just in March, and this actually was planning to buy these things before the current situation emerged, but I bought these 5 different collections from Gale that include State Department records from Laos and Cambodia, a previously non-digitized collection of newspapers that were circulated to American soldiers in Vietnam, and then these really interesting documents from early colonial period in the Dutch East Indies, and then some probably previously unseen and probably kind of dark documents that start period Indonesian history into Sukarno. And so I think that all of these things are really sort of beef up. And it's actually a good example of how these simultaneously are deepening our emphasis on Indonesia and Vietnam, but they also provide me really fun ways of expanding the collection so that there's still access to materials on Cambodia, access to materials on Laos. Right? Even if those aren't areas that I necessarily focus on, they're still being built because of the ways that these can complement our existing emphasis within the region. Now, I will take you very specifically through this trial that we have on Western books in Southeast Asia, because I think it's a really cool resource, and I'm very excited about hoping to be able to add it to the collection. Now, I hope that you've all seen this. You've probably heard me refer to it before. I have the sort of one-stop shop, your best friend for all things Southeast Asian studies when it comes to the Yale Library is the Southeast Asia Collection LibGuide. LibGuide just stands for Library Guide, or maybe Library Research Guide. That's very easy to find. You don't really even necessarily need the link, right? You could just as easily search Yale Southeast Asia Collection and you will find it. It's also on all of my profile pages in the library and on the council's website. Now this will take you, well, first it will take you to the homepage. And everybody can see that I'm on the LibGuide now, right? I'm not on the slides. Transition's working fine. Everybody sees that I'm the Yale Southeast Asia Collection home. Good, okay, good. Now I have this anxiety that I'm just talking into nothingness. So we'll take you here. You'll notice that the first thing I did was add this little extra top box that directs you to sort of larger news and services within the library in response to the current COVID-19 crisis and different policies as a relationship to that. Now within here, I've been working to revise this and change this over time. And style it in a way that I think works a little better. That's an ongoing process, but I want to direct your attention. Okay, good. So within this subject guide, the most important thing for you right now to look at is this e-archives and databases. Now, this is the part that I've really thrown in a lot of attention to over the past couple months, and I think that you'll find it very useful. I have it divided in a way that I hope kind of works, right? Over here on the side, I give you just a couple of articles that look at tips about using digital archives, or the methodological questions that come with them, right? And by methodological, I don't just mean like data collection methods, it also means sort of the epistemological and ontological issues that come with any sort of resource and any sort of research agenda. This is a way of directing you. It's a way of maybe, you know, offering some support and proposals and so on for using these materials, as well as opportunities for teaching with them. Then I include this other box specifically for resources directly from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Now I think these are really great resources overall. I think that they're surprisingly candid, right? They're usually like official statistics, but I think they're pretty solid official statistics by and large. You know, you make your own decisions on that, people who are using larger data. But it is a great source for comparative data and sort of quantitative projects more broadly. And it does also include quite a bit of GIS data for people using maps and spatial projects, as well as the ASEAN Digital Libraries. These are all fantastic resources. Now, in the center, which is the main place we're going to play with today for the next, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, I have it divided in two sections. I have digital archives, which is what I'm calling everything that is things that we've purchased. So things that Yale has a license for, that in order to access, you need to be on either the Yale network or on it through a VPN client. Right? These are things that you need to be signed in for in order to have access to, the things that we purchase and so on. Below that, I have listed the open access digital resources. These are things that are put forward primarily by public libraries, public university libraries, the University of Wisconsin, as well as private libraries that have a very strong public outreach component. So that would include Cornell, for example. And so these are all, I want to make sure that we're all very clear that these are not somehow lesser. And in fact, they're often very strongly designed by librarians and faculty, working together to digitize these resources and make them available publicly, right? So they're actually very strong resources, and we're going to look at one of them here in a second. The first thing I did want to go to was this new trial, because it's always important that we go through the new things. We're gonna work through 3 or 4 of these. If you're on the VPN client, the link should take you directly to this place. Don't be concerned, there are more than 3 things. In fact, there are 399 different monographs within this. Some of them are small pamphlets, some of them are large books. And I think, you can see that when you come on here, you can sort by languages. So one of the things that I think is really cool about this resource is that it's not just English language materials, it's coming from a host of different European written traditions, right? And in fact, some of them are quite old. I think that this collection ranges from, we can just look and make sure, 17th to 19th century. So it's quite an old collection, quite old, quite older materials. And it gives you a sense of sort of the breadth of the collection, right? English obviously is still there, so you don't necessarily know other languages, but it does point to the need for area studies scholars to always, and faculty of course already know this, that learning local languages is key, but learning research languages, languages about which those countries have been written, languages in which those countries have been written about is also, remains very important, right? And so scholars of Vietnam probably want to know French, for example. And you can sort through this very easily. I went through the Russian one. It's very exciting because it's old Russian, so it has a lot of extra characters and things. And it's just exciting linguistically to see the use of terms, right, and what kind of terms were used in these earlier periods to refer to Southeast Asia. And I think as an example of a research question, right, that might be useful, that might bring you to these materials, you might ask yourself sort of what explains variations between Portuguese and Dutch sort of intellectual history about Indonesia, right? And what are the differences between those materials in terms of how they're talking about those islands and what sort of explains those variations. And this would be an excellent source for those materials. Now you'll see, and this is why I wanted to start off with this one as well, you'll see that within you'll see that this collection, this Western Books on Southeast Asia, is housed within the Archives Unbound system, which is part of Gale's primary sources. Archives Unbound is also host to a lot of other collections on Southeast Asia as well as South Asia, especially when it comes to sort of primary documents related to the Vietnam War. And so you can, from here or from other places within LibGuide, you can sort of remove the restriction on just dealing with this collection, and you can look at all the different materials that we have available under Archives Unbound, right? Which is now temporarily, at least, going to include this Western Books on Southeast Asia. And if you get a chance to use this and you love it, let me know. That will help me. That will sort of help me with purchasing it later. So I want to move then so we're going to jump around a little bit here. I want to show you this. This is really cool. It's not just for research, but also really fun for just people who are interested in literature more broadly. Now, this is something that we've purchased, and so the link will take you through quick search, and you just click on online database. And if you're in the VPN client, it takes a second or two, but once it loads, you'll see that this is, here we go. So this is a really huge collection of just hundreds of books. They give us this page number, over 99,000 pages. But you figure that's got to be several hundred books at least. There's a lot. It's quite a bit of materials. It's all from South and Southeast Asian writers writing in English. So that comes up with a lot of like exciting kind of research questions you could ask yourselves. Now, I don't have much of a background in literature. One of the questions I really wanted to think about when I was looking through this stuff in preparation for today was thinking about, when do authors use local terms or local slang words in what is ostensibly an English language novel, right? And when do those terms get used? Who's using them? The context of those things, I think that's very interesting. When do those words sort of used as if they're an English word, right? Think about terms like coolie and things like that, or even the sort of funny, occasional use of Indonesian words within sort of English as it's spoken in the region, and this will give you some access to that, right, through the literary canon. And I think what's actually really cool about it is you can browse by place and author, and if you run by place, let's just do something a little bit unconventional. Maybe we'll sort of use Brunei. So we'll get ourselves to this book, Foolish. It both comes in this simple text format, but it will also show you the page image. And I think that in some cases, this is directly a scan from the original book. And so and I'm not sure from which edition, right? I'm sure that would change, but it could also give you a sense of material culture in a way related to literature, and history of the book type projects might also be supported by this. Let me just look at the chat here. I will come back to some of these questions in a second. Let's see. One more thing, license that I wanted to show you all was U.S. intelligence on Asia. This is sort of my plug for my background in political science. Again, it's something that we purchased. It's through a different vendor this time. It's from Brill. It's interesting. It's a collection of documents during the Cold War period from various U.S. intelligence agencies, all declassified, obviously. And it includes lots of materials that you might not you wouldn't have had access to before, but also gives you a really interesting opportunity to see how people in the intelligence community, if there is such a thing, were talking about Asia. And we're talking about Southeast Asia in this case in particular. It's a huge thing, right? So it has over 4,000 entries, so you have quite a broad range of materials here. And I think one of the interesting questions you might ask yourself, for those of you from more of an international relations background, is that what does this tell us about the role of individual decision-making in foreign policy outcomes, right? And in fact, is there some sort of difference between what individual intelligence officers are reporting and what the US as a state decides to do, right? And I think that there's lots of interesting questions to be asked about through that. And this is a cool collection of things to start asking those kinds of questions. Okay, now I want to, in my final moments, look at these open access digital resources. And I thought one of the things I would look at is this Southeast Asian images and text. These are all very valuable. I just thought this would be a fun one to give us a little bit of a visual studies component to our discussion today. Now this is something that's hosted by the University of Wisconsin. It's a lot of their image collections that they've made available publicly, as well as textual materials, obviously. Now just a little warning, the images in this come from wartime Laos. Well, a lot of them are from wartime Laos. And so there are some images of dead soldiers, and so that is coming in a second. So those of you who find that really reprehensible, it just kind of comes up right away. I haven't found a way to avoid it. But if you go to browse images, right, it's divided into collections already, but if you go to browse images, then you'll get access to these sorts of materials. And you can see that some of the images are some of them are nice, and some of them are quite eerie, and some of them sort of more nuanced. But what's interesting about this is that these collections come from some unexpected sources. And so, for example, the image on the side here of the war victim, for example, comes from a man who was working in Laos ostensibly for USAID, right? And he's during this period, right? USAID is obviously playing a very strategic role and sort of embedded within the intelligence community more broadly. And there's certainly sort of mixed, at the very least, mixed goals on the part of USAID for Southeast Asia at the time. So this potentially gives you an interesting kind of visual history of that involvement, right? And gives us some sort of visual data and a visual history of a sort of visual culture at the time too, because in the way that these images were saved and what they were used for, sort of what that person's goals were in collecting these types of images. There's plenty more to look through here. I recommend you kind of dig through it a little bit. And then if you kind of want a little more tailored access, let me know, and I'll probably send some things that maybe will fit a lot better with what you're looking for. Coming back to my presentation slides, I just wanted to remind you all that there are several open access resources that extend far beyond the bounds of area studies. One of them is the Internet Archive that's made some hundreds of ebooks available. And it's garnered some controversy amongst authors and publishers. And so, actually maybe an interesting topic in and of itself, but that's certainly one resource that you might look for looking for books more broadly. If you want to avoid the kind of issues that might come up with that, you will be happy to know that Yale has set up this temporary free resources page, the number of things from dealing with publishers and other types of vendors to give free resources during spring 2020. Those are things that probably will not continue, but nonetheless, you'll have access to them now, and it's a way of rounding out some of our e-resources moving through. Finally, HathiTrust, which is this kind of digital repository for quite a few member libraries, if not, I think the vast majority of academic libraries. They've made all their materials accessible. And so, and they've also been integrated into Quick Search. And so you have the ability to access ebooks that Yale previously didn't have. We kind of suddenly have. I mean, it didn't involve us necessarily purchasing them. It was more of an integration effort. And so that that should show up right within Quick Search, within your search results. It'll sort of give you some locations and then sort of an ebook and then like a multi-trusted. And so that should also help you moving forward. Here's my little tongue-in-cheek thing on rational choice, how to be a rational user to maximize your utility, maximize the bang for your buck and work with librarians. One of the things I often recommend that I think is a really smart way to do this is to think about your project, and maybe assuming it's an area studies project, it's really centered on a region, right? You start with working with your area studies librarian, that's me, for Southeast Asia and for South Asia. But then you also think about ways that you can jump off, right? And so you can start working with me on issues, and if you decide that there's this really important need for using maps and sort of spatial analysis, then I would connect you to our GIS librarian. Or if you decide it's a really data-driven project, now I have training in quantitative methods because I'm a political scientist by training, but maybe I'm not the best person. And so it's a really great opportunity to work with both people in Sterling, so people like me in area studies, as well as people in the Marks Library. Marks Library is the new name for CSSSI, so our science and social sciences library over there. And so it's a really, really nice way to do that. And then I also kind of would encourage you to think beyond disciplinary norms and how things are done in your discipline as sort of root learning, right? And I feel like as a graduate student, I was hesitant to do much work in digging through digital archives as one example, because I feel like those were for historians. That's something for historians to play with. I think that's a little silly that I thought that now, right? Because I think that I could have, my projects maybe aren't so strongly archival, but I could have found some interesting information to round out my work, both during the prospectus phase and all the way through the research cycle. And so finding ways to do that is really good. There's also, beyond being creative or being kind of qualitative in your thinking, if you're more of a social scientist, there are statistics embedded in that material. And so a lot of the pages on there are statistical tables with sort of interesting already quantified data or data that you could quantify either as maybe as dummy variables in some ways, or maybe for various types of network analysis, or even sort of quantitative approaches to text analysis and things like that. So these really are sort of resources that can be used broadly in any disciplinary context. And then I've mentioned several times, you have different opportunities to use these resources in different ways along the research cycle. And so thinking about them strategically and how they can help you throughout is I think the best way to go. And so finally, the library is open, not really, but kind of still open, still working. I'm still working here amongst my textiles and my orchids and so on. And so that is kind of where I wanted to end. Thank you for being here. I'll answer a couple questions. There's some in the side note here that I'm going to get to. And I just have to figure out how to end my screen share, and then I will see. This unexpected confusion in how I end the screen sharing process.
Brandon, there should be a thing at the top of your screen that says end share.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Or stop sharing or something.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Am I back?
Yep.
Back.
Okay. Thank you. I swear I sat through all the trainings for Zoom, and then I still find out that like what I thought was obvious suddenly becomes less obvious when you're doing it. Okay, so you can all see me now, I'm assuming. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to look through these questions here, and the rest of you can, if you want to think of any questions for me. Okay, so the trials, the Western books on Southeast Asia, I have until the end of May. And so hopefully you get a chance to look through that. Other things to do, of course, but it will be around until May, and then I will look into options for purchasing in the next fiscal year. So that earliest that would happen is in fall. Of course, that's unclear this time, but it's something that I have my eye on, and I was quite excited about it. For the rest of you. Yeah, you look into that. I think that if they're posted, looking at Eric's questions, are there statements about rights for images? And looking at that University of Wisconsin collection, for example, I would look into it. For the purposes of student papers and teaching, right, should be no problem. I'm not sure when it comes to publishing, it might be probably a different story. Something that this is one of the ways where not being trained as a librarian is an impediment for me. Sometimes I forget to ask that question. I want to know how to use it first. I don't think if I can use it. Let's see here. All right. Thank you. Robin reminded me that for the HathiTrust things, it's not the whole collection, right? It's only things that are under the public domain. And so there's some restrictions there.
So wait, and one more. It's the public domain. That's one part of it, and the other part is what matches our print holdings.
Okay.
So there's like actually two components. And
great. That's good to know. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, the public domain is basically permanent, but what matches our print collections is only emergency temporary access. So we only have it up till approximately the end of June. So use it now. Yeah. We don't really know how much longer these guys are going to be willing to keep letting us have this kind of access.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. Good. And then the last question I have here in chat is how can we download? So downloading the whole ebook is going to change depending on where we bought it from, and then what the license agreement is with that vendor. And so you'll see that it usually says something like you can download X number of pages, or you can print X number of pages, and there's sort of an allotment based on where that's hosted at and who has that. So it would change bit by bit. Yeah, and then the library is no physical resources. All the buildings are closed until further notice. And I think that further notice will be some months down the line. So keep an eye out for that, right? But everything physical is on lockdown. All the buildings are closed. Are there any other questions?
Brandon, I have a question. Do you have a sort of one-stop shop, or what's the best portal to enter to start finding access? Is it best just to go to the main library page and search something through the library catalog, or to go to your Southeast Asia collections guide? And how can we start sharing that source so that students stumble on it? You know, there's some of us here right now, and we'll know to look for it. But what are some ways in which we can have more links that lead people in the right direction to some of these sources?
Fantastic. So I think that you could go about this in a number of ways. And it kind of depends on where you are topically. If you know that you're going to be focusing on Southeast Asia, and that there's very much an area studies project, then I think starting at my LibGuide is really the way to go. And I will actually show you just in a second how to find that in a different way, actually in a way that might give you access to different kinds of LibGuides. However, there is an advantage still there's a real advantage to using Quick Search to search on a topic or a country and seeing what comes up, because it would probably bring you materials you wouldn't have otherwise anticipated needing to find. And so it kind of, in some ways, depends on where you are in the exploratory phase of the research, and so on. So using that subject guide as a way to, oh my goodness, what is this like? Sorry, I got this weird Java update. Using the research guide, the subject guide. Sorry, oh my goodness. This is why I can't be a diplomat. I always forget the right word. Using the subject guide as a way to find, if you kind of know, in a sense, you have some idea of topic and region, I think is a good way. But the Quick Search will allow you to kind of explore. And that option for exploration, I think, is really useful. It's actually one of the reasons why when things open up again, I do recommend going to the stacks, because when there's access to physical collections, it's really great to go look for, if you're looking for a book, you know that books on either side of it are going to be related somehow, right? And I always find tons of things I never thought I would find, and just that way. I wanted to see if I can be very savvy about this. So I was gonna just show you, okay, so if I go here, share. Okay, so now you guys can see my screen again, I think. Mm-hmm. When looking for other subject guides or research guides, I think that they're all housed here. So they're called research guides. The reason why I'm showing you this is because this is a good way to look at other options, right? Now that you know that these things exist, and to kind of tailor into that kind of maximum utility thing that I was talking about. So you might start with Southeast Asia collection, right? I recommend starting with Southeast Asia collection. The anthropology specific one is not as helpful. And I am the subject expert. It just hasn't updated. Michael Mang had it for a little while. But then you might want to go from there to looking at resources specific to government, right? Terrorism and so on. So this gives you an option to kind of look through those materials in a different way as well.
Brandon, I had another thought that occurred to me. So this summer, we're going to have a lot of students who are very innovative, trying to figure out ways to do research in a summer where you can't do, visits to physical archives, can't do field work in the same way, which is a big tragedy in so many ways. But one thing that will happen, I imagine, is this, we'll have a lot of students who are very creative, thinking about ways to find new sources for their research. And I wondered if there's a way we could create a kind of wiki of some sort, where as students stumble upon new digital resources, there's a way they could share them kind of in real time. I was just thinking, almost because you're one person, but we have, scores of students really who will be doing things about this and discovering all kinds of innovative things. So that's one thing I was thinking. And then the other thing, I've long thought about this, when we have students and faculty doing individual research projects, who do a lot of research and work to make a certain archival material available to themselves as a researcher, that involves oftentimes digitization or something, scanning document. Are there ways in which we could actually facilitate making that work kind of publicly available to other scholars, so that it's sort of like the open access data model in science, where somebody does some work for their own dissertation project, but also at the same time then creates a kind of online community of collaborating and sharing, contributing to the larger digitization movement, I guess.
I like this idea about being able to share findings, and I wonder if there's not some option for that, and even maybe a way to kind of encourage that. So what is a way to kind of embed a mini activity that faculty could use from the LibGuide, right? And then there's some options there that I want to think of for using materials like you're talking about like I have this whole thing from the Mizoram State Archives that they put on a disk for me. It's on my computer. I think that sort of thing has to be handled, faculty to faculty kind of thing. I suspect that the library itself couldn't necessarily be involved in that, although. But it's an interesting idea. I also think that one of the links I had on there was for the Vietnam Studies Group. Something along those lines. And they seem to host a lot of materials like that as well. I wonder if that, I'm trying to link to those kinds of things so that that they can be linked to that. But the library probably wouldn't, I don't know if there's a way to I'm sure that there is no way to kind of integrate that within the library's infrastructure.
Okay, thanks.
But I like this idea about Robin had a thought.
I'll just chip in for a second. The library, we avoid collecting personal research materials of faculty just because we'd be overwhelmed, and it's very difficult material to use, and it's raw material that you incorporate into your book and your publication later. So in general, we are not in that business. But we do have, I don't really know why we don't market it more, but there is Selected Works, which is like more or less the institutional research depository. And is this something that you've heard of? Like I said, we're not doing a very good job of. It's not it's not a library project per se, it's a university project, and it's a place where you can post your publications, but you can also post your drafts, and you could, I guess, theoretically put your research notes in there too. There's no restriction on what you put in it. It's just files as far as they're concerned. I'm not aware that anyone's actually using it for that purpose, but I think that that was sort of one of the ideas behind it. And then, of course, you can use Google Drive, and you can use Box and those other collaborative tools, Evernote, those sorts of things, to stick your raw notes into and share with your colleagues. But unfortunately, that's something the library itself, we don't do. So, sorry, Brandon.
No, thank you, Rob. No, it's fantastic. I'm really happy that you're here because I have your expertise is much appreciated.
Brandon.
Yes.
I have a question. It's good to see you all here, and thanks for doing this presentation. Hey, I was wondering, so I'm working with ER&M seniors or rising seniors, and a lot of them have their summer research plan pretty thwarted. And one way that we're trying to help redirect them is thinking about remote research possibilities. So the quick question is, are the librarians available over the summer for this type of consultation? And, you know, in Southeast Asian studies is one area, but other librarians in other subjects would, okay, that's great.
Absolutely, yes. So all the librarians, you know, with exceptions for sick leave or what have you, but all the subject librarians are working remotely, and I think we're all just as, if not more, eager to help and do consultations over Zoom or through email, etc. Any way that works for people, and you know. That's more or less following on the same timeline, you know, sort of Monday through Friday, 8:35, with flexibility on either end. So it's really, as far as that goes, it's as business as usual as it can be. That's for sure.
That's great. Thank you. A second question I have is in terms of collection development. So I saw in the PowerPoint you had, there's one link to Asian American stuff. Yeah. So I was wondering if diaspora is also part of your, you know, the collection development that you're thinking through as well with all of these Southeast Asian communities across the world.
Yeah, so it's something that those are materials that definitely get picked up. Materials written about Vietnam by the diaspora community, published in the U.S. or et cetera. Those are picked up. They're picked up in kind of a funny way, right? Because for me, it depends on where it depends on topic, and then where it's published. And so a lot of my collecting is coming directly from Vietnam. But in terms of digital archive, digital resources, sometimes those come to me, sometimes those come to other subject librarians. I don't know enough about that. Something I should look into. The one thing I think you saw in there was Asian American drama. There are other links in the LibGuide that that I can find and I can send more specific to like diaspora community. But I think it's linking to things, linking to sort of open access archival projects, I think a lot of the times, and then things that are often community driven, so things that are done by NGO type organizations collecting materials like that, or oral history projects, for example, I think come to mind as something. There's quite a bit of Vietnamese refugees oral history projects, at least one, but I think that there must be several more. So, those things are linked, and then if people need more help, I'm happy to help, and so that I need to look more into.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was just looking at the list here, and looks like we covered some of these topics. Yeah, so I mean, librarians are available now through summer, through fall. You know, we're all still working, and we're happy to help everybody with various consultation questions. And then for Gregory on the link to public access materials, right? So that's just through the LibGuide, Gregory, on here. It's just through the subject guide. The subject guide, it's the section underneath the digital archives where it says open access resources. Those are all. So hopefully that answers that. Are there any more questions? I'm looking for hands up, or feel free to just unmute yourself and come in. Yeah, feel free to send any purchase requests that you have. If they're available as an e-resource, and still within my budget, I will get them. Things like course, I'll just add that things like course reserves and things like that get picked up sort of automatic. You know, I think they've largely finished buying things for course reserves, but things directly for courses get picked up quite easily, and then any requests that you have. If I can find an e-resource, I'll try and get it. It's not, there's a disconnect here. I think you probably know this, but just because something is available as a Kindle edition doesn't mean there's also an ebook edition, right? Because the ebook edition and the Kindle edition come from different worlds. I don't necessarily know how that industry works out, but I often get people sending me Kindle links, but I can't obviously I can't buy Kindle products, and it doesn't always mean that there's an ebook available that I can purchase through an institutional account. Although I try whenever I can. So you know, I always, you know, send me everything you got, and then hopefully if I find it, I'll buy it. But it you know, might take a second. But the people who are processing these materials are also working still, so these things, although they're a little bit more delayed than usual, are still getting picked up and still getting added into the catalog fairly regularly. I've been impressed anyway, though that's been going rather smoothly. Okay, is that everything? Any more questions for me before we sign out? Oh, ending right at 1. I like this. This is very timely. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, the information you got this link from, you know, my email is on the council's webpage. You can also find me elsewhere. If you can see my name on the site, it's, you know, like everything at Yale, it's brandon.milioti@yale.edu for email. Otherwise, you know, Southeast Asia Librarian, etc. You'll find me that way. Lovely to talk to you all, and then we'll find ways of sort of maybe adding to my update on the council's webpage. That little update that I have on the council's webpage has links to the subject guide, etc. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.